It's always a great pleasure to be in Malta. This is my fourth trip here. My first time here, I was recently married. And I was here in the summer, and the entire island was brown. And after that, I've come back in the winter, and it's all green. And my grandfather actually came from Ireland. So I kind of prefer the green. So I think I love being in Malta in the kind of fall-winter period when it's all green here, rather than in the summer where it's really, really brown. I work with Human Life International. I've been working with them since 1998 and travel all around the world. It's a real blessing. We're in over 84 countries. HLI was founded by a monk, a Benedictine monk, Father Paul Marx. And if you know about the Benedictines, they're supposed to have a vow of stability. They're supposed to stay in their monasteries. And he ended up traveling, I think it was something like 10 or 12 times the distance to the moon and back. He was called the Flying Monk. He was all over the world. He had permission from his abbot, started Human Life International, and went all over the world. And it was really very beautiful because he started preaching the gospel of life even before Pope St. John Paul II coined the term, this gospel of life. And when he met with Pope St. John Paul II, the Pope said, "You're doing the most important work on earth, this pro-life work." So what I will talk to you a little bit today, I'm actually going to start with something I heard right here in Malta in 2007. We were having a training seminar with Paul and a gift of life for teachers. And we were very blessed. The Archbishop of Malta came, and he talked to us, and he said something that was really profound. He said, "The culture of death is both ancient and new." And I was like, this is very interesting. So what do you mean? He says, well, when you look at it, all these old cultures, all the civilizations of the world were cultures of death. And they, all the primitive pagan cultures, anywhere you went in the world, they practiced human sacrifice. They did not have this Christian vision of the right to life. And I had that experience a few years ago. I was in Tunisia, and we went to the site of Carthage. And just outside of the ancient Carthage, there's an area called Tophet, which is an old temple complex and a burial area, and they have the incinerated urns with the incinerated remains of these baby children, thousands of children that had been offered in sacrifice to the Phoenician gods of the Carthaginians. And when you walk around that place, you just feel it's like a haunted place. You feel that there's the death. And so this almost culture of death, right, existed everywhere in the world. And then there was this point of light, this first point of life, which was the chosen people, right, the Hebrews. And they were different. They were different from the others. And it's very interesting. You see in the book of Exodus, the Hebrew midwives. So Pharaoh gives the order that the midwives are supposed to kill the baby boys just as they're being born. And the Hebrew midwives refuse. They refuse to collaborate with that. They refuse to commit infanticide, even though that was going on forever. And then eventually the Hebrew people went out of Egypt, went to Israel, etc. But even in the period of the Roman Empire, one of the terms for the Jews were the people who do not abort. And that made them different. And we think that abortion is a modern problem. But you have to remember the Hippocratic Oath, the oath for doctors, comes from the 5th century BC. So 500 years before Christ, the oath says, "I will not commit abortion. I will not commit euthanasia." You wouldn't give that oath to doctors unless it was a real problem 500 years before Christ. And archaeologists have found these curettes, these medical instruments for performing abortions that are over 2,000 years old. And so when Christianity came, the early Christians, again, were different from everybody else because they were pro-life. They were not committing abortion. In fact, they would go and they would save the children that were being exposed. One of the things the ancient Romans would do if they didn't want a child is they would just leave the child out in the open to die. And the Christians would go and they would rescue these children and adopt them into their families. And Christianity became so strong that eventually it dominated the entire Roman Empire and converted the empire, etc., and abortion disappeared. And it became so influential, the Judeo-Christian view of defending life, that there was not a single country in the world with legal abortion until the 20th century. And then perhaps someone here knows, what's the first country to legalize abortion in the world? It happened in 1920. The first country was Soviet Russia. And Vladimir Lenin decided that he wanted to destroy the family, destroy the bourgeois family, destroy the Christianity, create the new atheistic state. And he decided that he was going to legalize abortion, legalize divorce, legalize abortion, and destroy Christianity, destroy the family that way. And so Soviet Russia became like the guiding light, right, for the abortion movement, the first country. And then one of the next countries to legalize abortion, 1935, Nazi Germany. And there it was the racial hygiene law, where they decided that they were going to force anybody who wasn't Aryan, who wasn't, from the master race, to have abortions. And during the occupation of Poland, they pushed abortion on all the Polish people and all the non-German speaking people. And I even found this amazing article from the Israeli Medical Association called Doctors, Pregnancy, Childbirth and Abortion During the Third Reich. And this is this Israeli doctor talking about how abortion and sterilization were used as instruments of the Nazi genocide. And when I was visiting in Auschwitz, I heard this incredible story. There was this Polish midwife from Warsaw who was smuggling children out of the Jewish ghetto. So there was a Jewish ghetto in Warsaw that was walled off, and all the Jews were kept in there until they were being shipped to the camps. And so she would go into the ghetto, and she would hide children in a wheelbarrow and then cover up the wheelbarrow, and then she would wheelbarrow the children out. And she saved tons and tons of children, but she was eventually caught. And so she was sent to the concentration camp. She arrived in Auschwitz, and Dr. Mengele was known as the Angel of Death, and he was the chief medical officer in Auschwitz-Birkenau, and he would do all these cruel medical experiments, especially on twins, etc. Anyway, he was the doctor in charge, and he said, okay, you're going to be a midwife here. Your role is to commit abortions on all the women who come in pregnant. And she told him to his face, no, I will not. And she was a prisoner in the camp. And Dr. Mengele was like, she was sure that she was signing her death certificate, but she was not going to participate in abortions. And he walked away and he let her live. She actually delivered something like 3,000 babies in the camp. And most of the babies died. But none of the babies died on birth. And she managed to save some of these babies. Some of the babies were actually adopted out of the camps. And she would put these little tattoos in hidden parts of the baby, like behind the ear, etc., so they could be recognized later on and reunited with their families, with surviving members of their families. I mean, this woman was an incredible pro-life hero. And she survived. She survived the war. She was put up for a Nobel Peace Prize. She only died like in the 1980s. But just incredible. Her name was Leszczyńska. But so you see this culture of death, as the Archbishop was saying, right? It's ancient, the ancient world, the pre-Christian world, and then the post-Christian world, right? When you have these atheistic ideologies, such as communism, such as Nazism, etc., you're in this post-Christian world, you no longer believe in God, no longer believe in Christ, then, of course, taking human life happens very easily. And this is really the world we live in today, right? This post-Christian atmosphere. And not only that, but it's, as I'm saying up here in a way, it's the world turned upside down, right? We are calling things that are good evil, and we're calling things that are evil good. And one of the clearest examples of this confusion is the gender ideology. So we have a situation today where a person proclaims, well, today I'm a man, and tomorrow I'm a woman, and the next day I'm, bisexual, and the next day I'm transsexual, and the next day I'm polymorphous sexual, and et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there's so many genders that they don't even know how many there are. There was a politician who was just having fun in the German parliament, and he started off his speech, and normally they start their speech by saying, "Dear ladies and gentlemen." He started his speech by saying, "Dear ladies, dear gentlemen, dear lesbians, dear homosexuals, dear transsexuals, dear etc." And he went through like all the different ones. The UN has something like 40 or 50 different. He did all of them. And then at the end of it, he said, "This is ridiculous." It's just silly. But people take this seriously. And there are cases of parents, because essentially this gets put into the school curriculums, and it's being taught to the children, etc. Parents protest this, and then they get kicked out of their countries. They get kicked out, put in jail. This has actually happened in Germany. It's happened in Sweden. It's happened in the U.S. and Canada. I mean, the absurdities are being pushed. And things that are good, like family, like life, well, that's seen, is evil. I remember this one time, there was a UN document that was presented forward, and someone noticed the fact that the only time that men were mentioned in the document was in a negative light. So male violence against children, fathers abusing their children, et cetera, et cetera. Every time there was a reference to men, it was as a negative. And the only child, and there was always reference to the girl child. So the girl child needs education, the girl child needs this, needs that, etc. And it was like, so boy children don't? But it's like this opposition, that is being placed there, an artificial one, to set men against women, and to make all these different divisions. And it's not helpful. It actually causes division in society. We're almost atomizing society. And whereas we should be, working together to be solidarity and to have families that are strong and united, we're saying, no, the men are on this side, the women are on this side, and we're going to divide them into further subgroups, and the children have rights against the parents, and the parents, it's a kind of a maximization of the individual against the community. And we should really be trying to build community. We should be trying to build love between all of our different individuals. This culture of life is really a culture of getting together and working together, as opposed to the culture of death, which is basically getting rid of problems by getting rid of people. And I remember it was very interesting. I've been to a lot of these UN meetings. I met my wife at a UN meeting. We were both doing lobbying in Istanbul in 1996. But we had young people who came, and they had these signs, because they were always talking about world population. The world is overpopulated. There are too many people, get rid of people, et cetera. And population control and all these things. And the children had these signs, and they said, "We are not the source of the problem. We are resources for finding solutions." And it's absolutely true. People are not the problem. Now, there are problems. The world has so many problems, but people are the solution. We need to help people to be part of the solution, not to consider people themselves a problem. And especially when I go to Africa, it's so sad to go into these African countries, and they really have this sense, right? Everybody thinks that we are a problem. There are too many Africans. There's nothing in Africa but problems, et cetera. The whole continent is messed up, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they have this kind of, sense of inferiority in it. And what I see when I go to Africa are happy, smiling people, many of them very faith-filled. I was in Ivory Coast, in Côte d'Ivoire. We went to this parish, and it was a Friday during Lent. And they had the Way of the Cross. And they had something like 3,000 people in this church praying the Way of the Cross. And I was very, very impressed. And so after I said, that's wonderful. Well, they said, not that many people showed up today. Normally there's more. And this is the third way of the cross today in this parish, and the one in the morning and at noon there are actually more people who come to that one. So they're very faith-filled, and I meet all these people, and they're wonderful families, and there's a lot of excitement and hope in Africa, but you don't get that from the media, There is poverty, but people generally are very happy, and the families are just joyful. And I always come back from Africa with a huge smile, because I have just a great experience of faith and family and the more fundamental values, right? The less materialistic values are very strong there. So why do we have to be concerned about this culture of life and this culture of death? One of the things, I received an email this morning. How many abortions have taken place in the year 2018? So we're the 15th of January. 15 days into 2018, how many abortions have taken place? Best guess. Yes. 1.5 million abortions worldwide have already happened in 2018. And if you look at the statistics of the World Health Organization, their leading cause of death in the world is heart disease. How many people die annually from heart disease? The answer is about 7.4 million people die, and that's the leading cause of death, according to the World Health Organization. But how many abortions happen every year worldwide? And the estimate is between 40 and 50 million. And it's only estimates, right? Because they don't know how many abortions happen. Most of the countries in the world, over half the countries in the world, do not have legal abortion. So most of Africa, almost all of Latin America, good parts of the Middle East, and then parts of Asia, etc. Some countries in Europe, such as Poland and Malta, Ireland, the microstates, such as the Principality of Liechtenstein, the Principality of Monaco, the Republic of Andorra, the Vatican City-State, the Republic of San Marino. All these places do not have legal abortion in Europe. But so around the world, so they estimate, how many illegal abortions happen, etc. But it is a huge number, And it dwarfs everything else. It's estimated that about 20% of pregnancies end in abortion. About 20% of pregnancies. If you want to go back in history and find something that's similar, like some kind of catastrophe that killed 20% of humanity, you have to go to the 14th century and the Black Plague. And the Black Plague eliminated about 30% of humanity. And that's about the only thing you can find that's worse than the current sort of abortion, terrible Holocaust that is going on. And the other thing that's incredible is how hidden all this is. I mean, people just don't see it. It happens in the back, and no one talks about it, and it just kind of percolates. I was in Croatia. We have a doctor who works there, and he told me that abortion is not the leading cause of death in Croatia for children. He said it was in vitro fertilization. So there are more children who died of IVF, embryos who die of IVF, in Croatia than are actually aborted. And something that just boggles the mind is that 90% of children that are conceived in vitro are never born. 90%. If there was any medical procedure that had a 90% failure rate and the patient died, they would discontinue that procedure. It's just unheard of. But it all depends on how you define success. And of course, the embryo is not considered a person in most places. And so they do all these genetic testing and all these things and discard these, or they do medical experimentation on the embryos, or they'll implant 3 embryos in the womb, and maybe 1 will be born. And they consider that 100% success, even though 66% of the embryos died. 2 out of the 3 embryos died. But that's considered 100% success. So it's very sad how many human lives are just completely trashed through that whole process. Pope Francis even has a term for it. He calls it the throwaway culture. And it's a good term because we live in this society, this world, where people are essentially throwaway materials. Use them and throw them away. And I saw this very, very interesting documentary about slavery. And it compared ancient slavery with modern slavery. And they said the essential difference between slavery in the ancient world and slavery in the modern world is that in the ancient world, they used to take care of their slaves to keep them alive so they could get more work out of them. In the modern world, they just use them and throw them away. So you have sex slaves that are trafficked into countries and they're used as prostitutes until they're no longer useful and then they're discarded. You have children who are used to work in mines and you work in all kinds of different slave labor until they can't work anymore and then they're tossed away. And we just live in this world where human life is really being discarded, thrown away. Pope Benedict XVI used to have this phrase, the dictatorship of relativism. And the whole gender ideology, et cetera, it's all about that. I mean, if you don't agree with me, then you are a hater, right? Hate speech. And they don't really believe in free speech. So they'll, anybody who disagrees with them, they'll throw them out, throw them in jail. And then we have this throwaway culture of people who are just being used and then cast aside. So when it comes to IVF, in vitro fertilization, it's something that really touches my heart because my wife and I had 9 years where we were not able to have children. We suffered from infertility for 9 years, and we had our little daughter, Thérèse. And we were really blessed, and then we haven't been able to have children since. So we've been suffering from secondary infertility since then. And when you suffer from infertility, people come up to you and they're like, well, why don't you use in vitro fertilization? Why don't you go this route or that? And it is really, really cruel what happens to the woman who goes for in vitro fertilization. They pump her full of drugs to hyperovulate so that they get many, many eggs. And there's actually a thing called hyperovulation syndrome, where women who have these procedures can actually die from the side effects of it. In about 6% of cases, the woman has grave physical harm caused by the drugs pumped in for hyperovulation. But then what happens? The embryos are then implanted in the woman, and they have a much higher rate of miscarriage than normal. So between 20 and 30% of these IVF pregnancies end up in miscarriages. And so the woman who's desperate to have a child then has a miscarriage and usually lives that in a much worse way than a regular. And the whole process is just incredibly inhuman. And what's very sad is that, here in Malta, you have NAPRO technology. And other countries as well, natural procreative technology. So basically just using fertility awareness techniques, using some medical healing techniques, laser surgery and whatnot, to heal the problems of infertility. And they have a much higher success rate than in vitro fertilization, and yet still it's being practiced. And you have to wonder why people still do this if it's very expensive, has a very high failure rate, and doesn't have very many practical benefits when there's something very natural and normal and higher success rate that costs much less money, et cetera, that's available. To me, it seems just ideological. Why would one pick this rather than that? Well, of course, you do get a lot of embryos that you can then use for stem cell research and all kinds of other things. But, why would you do it for objective reasons? It doesn't make very much sense. And the other thing that is incredibly sad, probably one of the saddest things I've read, is a study. And the study was called My Daddy's Name is Donor. My Daddy's Name is Donor. Anonymous donation of gametes, sperm donation, etc. And these people who were conceived in a laboratory by an anonymous donor what happens to them psychologically, physically, etc. And so these people were talking about all the different challenges that they had, and it was incredible. They had much higher rates of delinquency, of substance abuse, of depression, despite the quality control that is put on these embryos, etc., much higher rates of disease and genetic problems, etc. And even like the fear that they were going to be sexually attracted to a half-brother and a half-sister, because they don't know who their father is, they don't know who their mother is. It's just incredibly inhuman. And this is being done all over the world. And we don't even know the long-term effects. The first child that was born through in vitro fertilization was in 1978, Louise Brown. So we don't even know the multi-generational effects of this, and using these artificial techniques. But when we think about the alternative, right, that natural procreative technology exists, it's just hard to imagine why this is allowed to continue. I really recommend Donum Vitae and Dignitatis Personae. These are two documents from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith that kind of go into detail about the rights and dignity of the human embryo, etc. And it's wonderful reading. It just shows how the church has this loving look at the dignity of the human person and how we have the right to be conceived in love by our parents and not to be treated as an object, treated as something that can be manufactured in a laboratory, and even worse, because now there's kind of this move to go towards artificial wombs and cloning and whatnot. The Chinese in particular are working on the artificial womb and on cloning techniques. And it's just, it's like the Brave New World, that famous novel by Aldous Huxley, but it's just really crazy, and you could do genetic manipulation to where you create a chimera, which is introducing animal genes into the human DNA and creating these hybrids between humans and animals. I mean, it is really bad science fiction. But people are seriously contemplating doing this because they have lost respect for human dignity, for the human person. One time I was speaking in India, and it was a very interesting experience because the people were like, well, okay, you're talking to us about abortion, you're talking about these other problems, but there are other things out there. There's drug addiction, and there are wars, and there are all these other things, and you as a pro-lifer should be involved in that as well. And I found it very interesting because I had this reaction in a number of places. Is, okay, so it's a fair question. Why do you focus on abortion or some of these other topics, euthanasia or something else, when there are other things that take human lives? And essentially the answer is the scale, right? I mean, there is nothing in the world today that takes 40 million lives. Nothing. I mean, the next thing is heart disease, 7.4 million lives a year. So it's a tragedy that's on a huge, huge scale, and very few people talk about it. But the other interesting thing is, people talk about, if I was an activist, animal rights activist, and I was trying to defend the gorillas in Africa, nobody would criticize me and say, yes, you're defending the apes in Africa and Uganda and Rwanda, etc., but you're doing nothing about the whales. You should be fighting for the whales instead of for the apes. And people don't criticize other groups, but when people start talking about abortion, they're like, but you should start talking about this, that, and the other. And it's interesting because in the United States in particular, we have the death penalty. And so it's a pro-life issue, right? I mean, you're not supposed to be killing people, and there's a death penalty. But how many people are executed in the United States? In the year 2015, there were 28 executions, and there were about 1 million abortions. And so if you paid the same attention to capital punishment as you paid to abortion, you'd say that 28 lives is on the same scale as 1 million. There's just a difference there. How many people have died from the AIDS epidemic, the AIDS pandemic, from the very beginning of the epidemic to today? Best guess. Someone? The World Health Organization estimates about 39 million people have died of AIDS. from the very beginning, the early 1980s, all the way to the present. So that was a tragedy and is a tragedy. And it's correct that people should fight against AIDS and the spread of AIDS. But the scale of the problem is less than 1 year's number of abortions, just to put things into perspective. Yeah? And how much money has been spent to stop AIDS, and how much money has been spent to stop abortion? It's just the comparison is an interesting one. And it becomes kind of, we call it a red herring argument. One of the things I talk about is, it's a famous quotation from Mark Twain. Mark Twain was an American author, and he said that there are lies, there are damn lies, and then there are statistics. And pretty much the point is you can make statistics about anything you want. And in the abortion debate, this has happened. People have invented statistics in order to get abortion legalized, in order to make it seem more palatable, etc. Dr. Bernard Nathanson, who was an abortion doctor, who was part of NARAL, the National Abortion Rights Action League, he and other groups were promoting the statistic that 10,000 women were dying every year in America from illegal abortions, and that it should be legalized in the United States because too many women were dying of unsafe, illegal abortions. And they knew that the real statistic was about 200 to 250 women, but they used the figure 10,000 because that struck people's imagination. And because the press would not really research it, and they were kind of in favor of legalizing abortion, they got away with it. And then Dr. Nathanson had a conversion. Actually, Father Marks, the founder of HLI, was kind of involved in his conversion. He died a Catholic. He first became pro-life, then he became Christian, and finally he became a Catholic. And he just admitted, he had personally performed about 24,000 abortions. And then he converted and became a big pro-lifer. He made the famous films, The Silent Scream, The Eclipse of Reason, etc. He became just a very, very strong, wonderful pro-lifer. But he told us what had happened when he was on the other side, how he would just make things up. I was at a UN conference in the 1990s, and they claimed at the UN conference that we have to legalize abortion around the world. Most countries in the world do not have legal abortion. Basically, legal abortion occurs in Western Europe, North America, Japan, China, India, a few of these countries, but the rest of the world doesn't have abortion. So it's basically the rich countries mainly, industrialized countries that have it. So they're trying to push this on the more poor countries and the southern hemisphere countries. And so they were claiming that 500,000 women a year are dying of illegal abortions. And they were not clever enough because they broke it down into statistics per country. And they gave a statistic for the country of Venezuela. How many women were dying of illegal abortions because they don't have legal abortion in Venezuela? How many were dying there? And they said, 30,000 women are dying in Venezuela every year of illegal abortion. So this Venezuelan lady went and got the statistics, the mortality statistics for women in her country between the ages of 15 and 45. And less than 30,000 women had died of all causes in Venezuela between the ages of 15 and 45. So they were claiming that, illegal abortion was causing 30,000 deaths. 30,000 women hadn't even died between that, but they were just making the numbers up. I was in Benin in West Africa, and there was a wonderful doctor there. They were doing a study on abortion, illegal abortion in her country. And the way they were doing the statistics was any woman who came in the hospital who'd had a miscarriage, so she'd had a natural miscarriage, they counted her as having had an abortion. And they just tallied up all the women having miscarriages, and that was how they were coming up with their abortion statistic for the country. And then they were going to publish this, and then she blew the whistle and said, wait a second, that woman didn't have an abortion. She had a miscarriage. And so she stopped it. But if she hadn't been there, there would have been a study published on how, all these hundreds of women were having abortions in her country who weren't. So a lot of these statistics are just made up. And we have to be very careful when we hear what's going on and check sources. What are these people saying and why are they saying it, etc. The other thing that happens a lot is the other side presents itself and they say, we are pro-choice. And that's a very successful argument, right? Because who wants to be anti-choice? Choice is a good thing. But what really counts, of course, is what is being chosen, right? I mean, I'm not going to be pro-choice about murder. I'm not going to be pro-choice about rape. I'm not going to be pro-choice about, I can be pro-choice between coffee and tea, or between things that are real choices. But when you have something that is clearly bad, we don't say that we're pro-choice on this. And the other thing that is incredible is how hypocritical the other side will be. So they call themselves pro-choice, but as soon as, and we've seen this in the United States, you try to pass a law to inform women about the consequences of abortion, the alternatives to abortion, anything, give them choices, other choices besides abortion. And they, oh, no, you can't pass that law, it's not good. You try to pass a waiting period law, so you have to wait a few days before having the abortion so you can really think it over, so you can have an informed choice and not be rushed into it. Oh, no, that's not good. They're even against conscientious objection. So they don't want to give doctors the choice if they want to perform abortions or not. No, that's not a good thing. And they have all these campaigns against it. I actually did my PhD, my doctorate, on conscience in healthcare. So the right of medical personnel not to participate in actions that they think are wrong. And it's a fundamental human right. It was very, very nice. Pope Francis was flying back from the United States. And people asked him, it was just after they had passed same-sex marriage in America. And there was a government clerk, who refused to sign the marriage certificates for same-sex marriages. And she was being put in jail for doing so. But she said, I have a conscientious right not to be forced to do this. And so people asked Pope Francis, what he thought about it. He says, well, conscientious objection is a human right. So if that government worker happens to be a human being, then I think they should probably have that right. Just because you work for the government doesn't mean you lose your rights, as a human being. Human rights don't depend on your job, or on your income or anything else. It's just because of your being human. But it's interesting. The pro-choice side, so-called, is not in favor of choice. Well, the most incredible thing, most remarkable thing is Dr. David Reardon. In the United States, he said, look, we can't speak for women. I'm a man. I can't speak for women. Let us ask the women. Ask the women, why are you having an abortion? And so he interviewed hundreds of women who had abortions. He asked them, why did you have the abortion? What was the reason? And the number one answer was, I felt that I had no choice. And so you have this situation where the abortion campaigners call themselves pro-choice. And the women having the abortions say, I have no choice. And they ask them, why do you feel you have no choice? He says, well, I'm being pressured to have this abortion. I don't have the financial means to have the child right now. The medical doctors told me I had to have the abortion, or my job told, or the boyfriend, or my parents, or whatever. But there's all this pressure that is being put. And there's one of these feminists who's in favor of abortion. She's in favor of abortion, but she's honest. She's just honest. And she said, a woman wants to have an abortion like an animal that's caught in a trap wants to cut off the limb that is caught in the trap to get away. They don't want the abortion. And a truly loving society will provide them with choices, with alternatives, not to have it. It's like the opposite of the maternal instinct. Something that Mother Teresa of Calcutta, I just love Mother Teresa and her quotation. She said this in 1994 in front of President Bill Clinton. It was a national prayer breakfast. And she said, abortion is the greatest destroyer of peace in the world. And people were like, okay, why is abortion the greatest destroyer of peace in the world? And she says, because if you cannot tell a mother not to kill her own child, how can you tell anyone not to kill another person? If the bond between the mother and her own baby is not sacred, and they can sever that bond and kill that child, then someone else, a neighbor or some other person, I mean, what is that relationship? It's nothing in comparison. So she used to say, I mean, the fruit of abortion is nuclear war. Something else that she said. Because once you've destroyed that sacred link, that life is sacred, then you can kill anybody. You can really just go out. In fact, I've noticed, all these different places where they have massacres, where someone goes in and starts shooting up a school and killing all these children and massacring children in schools, they always happen in countries with legal abortion. They've happened in the United States, they've happened in Sweden, they've happened in China, all these different countries where the respect for life has been eroded, has been destroyed over time. The other thing that's incredible is people present abortion as being pro-woman. Pro-woman. And has anyone here heard of sex selection abortion? You've heard the term, yeah. So essentially, a sex selection abortion is when they determine the sex of the child, they find out if the child is a boy or a girl before birth, and then they have the abortion because they're having the wrong sex. So generally speaking, they don't want a baby girl. And so they'll have the abortion just to kill the baby girl. If they find out they're having a baby boy, they won't have the abortion. The estimate is there are about 100 million missing girls that have been selectively aborted. So here we're talking about the greatest crime of discrimination against women in the history of the world. And it's happening through abortion. And so these groups that say we are pro-woman, we are pro-woman, we're defending women, we're women's rights organizations. When you ask them to stand up against sex selection abortion, maybe you're in favor of other abortions, but this is abortion to kill baby girls. Will you stand with us here? And the answer is no. The answer is no. There are a few feminists who will get up and say, oh, okay, I'm against sex selection abortion. But the major organizations, the major groups, I was reading these different books, and they would say it. They would say it. It's a horrible tragedy. But the right to abortion is more important than the right to life of the baby girl. And if we ban sex selection abortions, then we'll start banning other abortions, and that's not acceptable. In my opinion, anybody who's in favor of sex selection abortion, the killing of baby girls, can no longer call themselves pro-woman. I mean, it's just complete absurdity at this point. And there was even, Secretary General of the United Nations who put out a global study about violence against children. And they were talking about all the different forms of violence, and they didn't mention sex selection abortion. And it happens all over the world. There are provinces in China where about 130 to 135 boys are born for every 100 girls. And there's an estimate that in a few years there'll be about 50 or 60 million more men than women in China. The birth ratios have been so destabilized. I was in Taiwan a few years ago, and there's this thriving market on mail order brides, where they order women to come over because they can't find women to get married. And so there were all these Filipino ladies and ladies from Vietnam, et cetera, who are being imported into Taiwan, in this place. But it happens in other places too, where the sex selection abortions have just destroyed the ratio. And it's completely ridiculous. Well, if this deadly discrimination against women, and it's the greatest in recorded history, 100 million just missing women. At this point, women tend to live longer than men. They have more longevity. Average lifespan is a little bit longer. So on Earth today, there are more women than men. But it's estimated that just in a few years, probably in about 10, 20 years, there'll be more men than women on Earth just because so many have been eliminated before birth. So, this brings me kind of to my conclusion. At every period in history, there was something that was a priority. There was something that had to happen. If I was living in early 19th century Britain, and I was not part of William Wilberforce's anti-slave trade movement, I had missed the boat. If I was alive in the early 1950s and 1960s, and I was not involved in the civil rights movement, and Martin Luther King and fighting for the rights of the black people who were being discriminated against, I missed the boat. If I was in South Africa and I was not fighting against apartheid in the 1990s, I missed the boat. If today we are not involved in fighting abortion, we're missing the boat. This is the crisis of our generation. I mean, it's completely unsustainable. If you look at globally, the birth rate right now is about 2.36. So to keep a population stable, you have to have about 2.1 children on average. The global birth rate right now is 2.36. It's estimated probably by 2025, about in 8 years, the global birth rate will fall below replacement level. World population, huge number of factors, but certainly will peak and start to decline in the 21st century. We're, especially in Europe, Malta has 1.55, the total fertility rate in Malta. So way below replacement fertility. That's true throughout Europe. And it's true in North America. It's true the sad thing is the average Japanese today is 55 years old. The estimate is, I think in 2025, the average Japanese is going to be over 60 years old. The average person. So you'll have a geriatric society. And one of the sad things that happens in Japan, actually, is that people have no grandchildren. No grandchildren. So there's this thriving market where they have these little robots that look like babies. And the little robots say, "I love you." And they act like a little baby, and they'll cry and this thing. And people buy the robots because they don't have real grandchildren, as something to console it. But it's very, very sad. This kind of aging, they call it the gray tsunami in Japan. But this society which is scared of life. Well, what we need to look at, is how we can save the world. How we can save the world. Of those women who said, "I had no choice. I felt that I had no choice," Dr. Reardon asked them, "What would have changed your mind? What would have helped you not to have the abortion?" And 83% of those women said, if one person had said, "Don't have the abortion," I wouldn't have done it. If my father had said it, if my mother had said it, if the boyfriend had said it, if the father of the child had said it, I would not have done it. But nobody said, "Don't have that abortion." And so I felt I had no choice. I had no support. No one was there to help me. So I was, and in fact, they weren't helping me not to have the abortion. They were pushing me. They were pushing me in that direction. We can literally stand up and save human lives, each. There's one of my favorite stories. A very good friend of my sister. She was a teenage girl. She grew up in South Texas. Her name was Christina. And she, just from the environment, thought that abortion was not good for her, but maybe it was good for somebody else. She was basically pro-choice and thought that was fine. And so my sister talked to her and said, "No, abortion is the killing of a child. You can't be in favor of that." And she gave her all the scientific arguments, et cetera. And Christina really studied it, et cetera. She became convinced and a strong pro-lifer. And then she went to university. And she goes to the university, she arrives at university, and there's no pro-life student club at her university. So she starts one. And every year they have this kind of freshers fair type of thing where all the different clubs in the university have a little table. And so she started the pro-life student club, and she had some, materials she got from different pro-life groups, et cetera. And she stood there and she had a sign-up list, and she signed up people and started the club. And it was great. People were very happy. They started up. She came back the second year, and she was there. She had her table, et cetera. And this young lady walks up and she says, "I want to thank you." And Christina's like, "Oh, wonderful. Yeah. Have we met? Have we talked?" And she, No, we never talked, but you were here last year. And, you had some information, and I just took some of the information, and I saw what you said, and I was pregnant. And I was going to have an abortion. But because I saw you and I read this material, I didn't. And she took out a picture, and she showed her name is Bianca. And she's alive today because you were here. And she had saved a human life by standing at a table for 2 hours and just passing out information. And it is just so incredible that we can save a precious human life simply by talking about it, simply by presenting a little bit of information, by just talking to people around us. There's so many people that are tempted, that are in despair, and they just need a good word. We have a doctor who works with us, Dr. Resides. I mentioned him in context of Croatia. He goes to many, many different countries. He was in Russia. And he was in a hospital where they were committing abortion. And there are all these women who are waiting in the waiting room to have abortions. And so he asked for permission to talk to them. And they gave him permission. And so he went and said, is there anything that I can do to help you not have an abortion? Abortion is a terrible thing, etc. And he just gave him a little small pro-life talk. And one of the women got up and said, "Thank you so much. I just needed to hear somebody say that. And I'm not going to have the abortion." There's a group, it's called 40 Days for Life. 40 Days for Life came up with this idea. It actually started in Texas, so it has to be good if it came from Texas. But it started in College Station, where Texas A&M is. And the idea was to pray 40 days for life during Lent. And so they did this, and now it's become a worldwide movement. They're all over the place. But they've saved so many lives by praying outside of the abortion centers. And in London, my good friend Robert Cahoon was there, and so many women did not go in to have the abortions. And they turned around and saved the life of their child. So they asked these women, why? Why did you choose life? You had the appointment, you were going to have the abortion. And the number one answer they received, and this is incredible, the women said, "I had made a pact with God that if I was not supposed to have the abortion, that somebody would say, 'Don't do it.' And when I saw you there with your pro-life witness, I knew that God was speaking to me that I shouldn't do it." And so they were going to have the abortion, but they told God, "Well, if I'm not supposed to have it, somebody will be there to stop me." And sure enough, there was somebody who cared enough to be there on the sidewalk. And so just our witness can save human lives, become real heroes. And that's what I hope for Malta. A gift of life here in Malta, Hope Malta, have been doing these wonderful things. And I hope it continues. It's interesting when I go to other countries around the world. They ask me, "What is one of your favorite places to go?" And I say, "It's Malta." And they ask me why. I says, "Well, it's incredibly Catholic. They have no abortions. It's just I love history, and so the history here and the architecture is beautiful, etc. But it's a real witness. It's a real witness to life. Another one of my favorite countries is Costa Rica. Costa Rica is a little bit like Malta, right? They have no military. They only have a police force. And they have life from conception in their constitution. And the Ticos, the people from Costa Rica, are just such a pro-life and joy-filled people. It's a beautiful, they have tropical rainforests, etc. It's a beautiful, beautiful country. But this pro-life spirit, right, in the country is just beautiful to see. And they're very strong Catholics, etc. So it's interesting, they ask me, "Well, what countries do you like?" I say, "Well, I definitely like Malta and I like Costa Rica." But there's so many beautiful, beautiful witnesses. And it's a treasure. It's a real treasure to be preserved. And unfortunately, every place that stands up for life will be attacked. And you can see this, in Ireland, they're being attacked. In Poland, they're being attacked. Malta, will be attacked because you're standing up for life. And if you do this, Christ always said this. He told his disciples, "You will not have an easy life." I don't promise you riches. I don't promise you fame. I promise you eternal life. And we have to be happy enough with eternal life. In this life, we have to work. And we won't necessarily be popular, but we will do very, very important things. And defending human life, defending precious, precious life, defending women from having this terrible, terrible, just heart-wrenching, horrible procedure. That is what we need to do. We need to create this culture of life to where abortion is not just illegal. Abortion is unthinkable. We need to move to that next step where we become a truly pro-life culture everywhere around the world. And it's beautiful to see the church, pushing in this direction. But we really need this worldwide movement for life. Pope St. John Paul II called for this in Evangelium Vitae. So we need a worldwide movement of prayer for life. There's a very beautiful movement in France. I live in France. And it's the Saturday before the first Sunday of Advent. Pope Benedict XVI had said, this is a wonderful time to have a pro-life vigil, les veillées pour la vie, vigils for life. And it started in 2010. And this past year, there were 280 of these vigils in churches where people are praying for life on the Saturday before the first Sunday of Advent. And Christmas is the birth of the Christ child. So the whole period of Advent, we're thinking about pregnancy in a way. We're getting ready for the birth of Christ, and so we have to be rejoicing for this pregnancy. And pregnancy is something to be rejoiced. It's not something to be mourned. And so that pro-life vigil is a beautiful, beautiful thing. And we're trying to spread that through Human Life International all over the world. We think Pope Benedict had a very good idea there to make these prayers for life right at the very beginning of the Advent season. And there are all these different other initiatives, but I'll stop here and we'll have some questions. So thank you very much.